Excavation on Lindisfarne has not uncovered a single destruction layer stamped with the famous year 793. The date survives primarily through written testimony, while archaeology reveals a monastery that endured beyond the attack. Yet 793 still anchors countless timelines as the moment the Viking Age began. That apparent precision disguises a choice about geography, evidence, and what kind of change deserves a beginning. An age cannot start everywhere on one morning. Can only be dated according to the historical process a scholar intends the label to describe. For Western European rating, Lindisfarne remains a powerful marker because its impact was recorded near the event. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes ominous signs and an attack on the church at Lindisfarne. Its surviving manuscripts were compiled later, so the entry must be assessed beside evidence closer to 793. Alcuin, a Northumbrian scholar serving Charlemagne, wrote letters responding to the assault soon afterward. His reaction treats the attack as a religious and social calamity, not merely another coastal robbery. He asked how such a disaster could strike a church associated with St. Cuthbert. Alcuin's moral interpretation belongs to his Christian worldview, while his testimony confirms the event's contemporary shock. The raiders' names, exact origin, numbers, route, and detailed actions remain uncertain. Later imagination supplies more choreography than the early sources can carry. Even so, Lindisfarne joined a recorded attack, a prominent sacred site, and a surviving international response. Those qualities made it ideal for later historians seeking a recognizable opening. But the English record itself places Scandinavian violence before that year. An entry conventionally dated 789 reports ships reaching Portland on the coast of Wessex. A royal official approached the newcomers and was killed, apparently, after trying to take them to the king's settlement. The Chronicle calls them the first Danish ships to reach England, although its wording and chronology require caution. Its account survives through later compilation, and the visitor's precise identity cannot now be verified independently. If Portland counts as a Viking encounter, England's familiar beginning moves at least several years earlier. If an age requires sustained raiding rather than one episode, the threshold moves again. Attacks followed during the 790s at places including Jarrow and Iona, establishing repetition where Portland offered only an incident. By the early 9th century, raids affected wider stretches of Britain, Ireland, and the Frankish coasts. The sequence from isolated arrivals to recurring campaigns looks more like a dawning period than an opening bell. Western texts nevertheless show only the side of Scandinavian expansion visible to literate Christian institutions. Across the Baltic, maritime mobility, trade, armed retinues, and violence had older histories. The boat burials at Salme in Estonia forced that earlier horizon into view. 2 vessels contained the remains of dozens of men, weapons, gaming pieces, animals, and other objects. Archaeological dating places the burials around the middle of the 8th century, before Lindisfarne. Isotope and artifact studies connect many of the dead with central Sweden, though individual identities remain unrecoverable. Their injuries indicate violent conflict, but the surviving evidence does not reveal the expedition's exact purpose. Calling them Vikings would answer a definitional question that the graves themselves cannot settle. They could have been raiders, diplomats, warriors in service, or participants in another armed overseas venture. What Salme proves is that organized Scandinavian maritime expeditions and lethal encounters preceded 793. That finding does not simply replace Lindisfarne with a new universal start date. Instead, it exposes how a Western documentary boundary had been mistaken for the beginning of Scandinavian movement. Trade likewise developed before the iconic monastery attack. Ribe, in present-day Denmark, grew as a market center during the 8th century. Craft production, imported materials, weights, and exchange connected the North Sea world before chroniclers announced an age of raids. Farther east, early settlement at Staraya Ladoga formed part of river networks linking the Baltic with inland routes. Dendrochronology dates preserved timbers by matching tree ring patterns, giving unusually precise evidence for phases of construction. Such dating establishes when wood was felled, not the ethnicity or private intentions of every resident. These market and settlement traces matter because mobility required knowledge, vessels, contacts, and places of exchange. Raiding did not emerge from an isolated shore without maritime infrastructure. Ship technology also developed through long experimentation rather than sudden invention in 793. The clinker-built tradition joined overlapping planks into flexible hulls suited to northern waters. Different vessels served transport, fishing, trade, prestige, and warfare, so no single design created the Viking Age. The sails, rigging, ironwork, and timber behind expansion depended upon accumulated craft knowledge. Social changes inside Scandinavia may have helped larger ventures become possible. Growing competition among elites, expanding exchange, and political consolidation are commonly discussed as contributing conditions. Their relative importance remains debated, and they did not operate uniformly across every region. No document records a Scandinavian council deciding to inaugurate an age of overseas activity. The beginnings lie in converging developments whose traces become visible at different times. Another proposed boundary looks beyond raids to sustained presence. In England, the arrival of the so-called Great Heathen Army in 865 opened campaigns that produced conquest and settlement. That date marks a transformation in scale, but it excludes more than 70 years already recognizable as Viking activity. Ireland offers its own sequence from raids beginning in 795 toward fortified ship bases and deeper political involvement. Frankish regions faced attacks by the opening years of the 9th century, followed by changing defenses and tribute. Each coastline therefore acquired its own chronology of first contact, repeated attack, overwintering, and settlement. Scandinavian societies also entered the period through markedly different regional transformations. Denmark's proximity to the Carolingian frontier created political pressures unlike those around the North Atlantic. Swedish-linked movement through the Baltic followed routes whose milestones do not depend upon English monasteries. Norwegian coastal communities participated in Western expansion, but their local transformations cannot be reduced to one raid. Within Scandinavia, burial customs and settlement patterns changed along timelines that resist one imported English boundary. The phrase Viking Age was created by later scholarship to organize these overlapping histories. It is not a period name used consistently by the people living through it. Modern chronological labels are valuable when their boundaries clarify a question rather than masquerade as natural facts. Many general histories use roughly 750 to 1050 for broad Scandinavian developments. Others retain 793 to 1066 for narratives centered upon attacks and conquest in England. Regional studies may begin earlier or later according to settlement evidence, political change, or maritime contact. These variations are not errors when authors explain what their chosen dates measure. Different questions may legitimately select different boundaries while describing the same broad centuries. Problems arise when a textbook boundary becomes a claim that nothing Viking-like existed before it. Lindisfarne itself demonstrates why events and periods operate differently. The raid occurred in 793, and that date remains historically meaningful. Monastic life continued there, while later threats and political instability eventually shaped relocation of Cuthbert's community. One attack did not instantly overturn all Northumbrian society. Its lasting symbolic force came partly from writers who understood sacred violation as a judgment upon Christians. Modern storytelling preserved the shock because it offers a dramatic threshold with a named place and exact year. Archaeology supplies slower images, workshop waste, repaired buildings, buried boats, worn tools, and timbers cut across decades. Those materials resist a single opening scene while explaining how movement became sustainable. The most defensible answer, therefore, depends upon scale. For the conventional beginning of recorded Viking raiding in Britain, 793 remains the standard landmark. For Scandinavian overseas violence, Salme demonstrates activity before that boundary. For long-distance exchange and maritime capacity, developments reach deeper into the 8th century and earlier traditions. For conquest and large-scale settlement, later 9th century dates may answer a more precise question. Political historians can choose still other thresholds when royal institutions become their central subject. No one option cancels the others because each identifies a different threshold. The evidence becomes misleading only when those thresholds are collapsed into one supposedly universal beginning. Future discoveries may push particular activities earlier without uncovering an original Viking moment. A securely dated coastal site connecting Scandinavian crews, purpose, and sustained operations would sharpen one regional chronology. It still could not synchronize England, Ireland, Francia, the Baltic, and Scandinavia itself. Returning to Lindisfarne, the absence of a neat archaeological scar now carries a useful lesson. Written sources preserve the raid's date and contemporary consequence, while the soil records endurance and longer change. Together they make 793 a landmark rather than a creation story. The Viking Age began whenever related maritime networks became the process under investigation. On an English monastery's calendar, that beginning is 793. Across the wider seas, dawn had already arrived unevenly.